Good afternoon, everyone. An introduction to ethics. I'm going to be providing a brief lecture about this week's readings. This is Chapter 7 from Michael Sandel's Justice, and this week's readings deal with the topic of affirmative action. So again, I just want to remind you of the bigger context for sort of considering these questions in Michael Sandel's book. So we dealt with the role of markets as it relates to morality, and we also dealt with the political philosophy of libertarianism. And in sort of thinking through these different issues in Sandel and sort of thinking through different laws, different policies, different regulations, we're sort of asking how do the moral theories that we studied in the first half of the semester sort of find their way into these conversations about the law, about politics, about policies? How do these discussions about morality find their way into these debates about certain policies? And now we're looking at another one. We're looking at affirmative action. And first of all, I think it's sort of important to think about what affirmative action is as a policy. It may be something you've heard of, but affirmative action is something that's been around. It sort of emerged in the 20th century. It's something that is constantly evolving in terms of what the laws surrounding affirmative action are. You see in the book that it mentions a case that was brought before the Supreme Court by a university. So affirmative action typically finds itself in the context of employment and education. And the question surrounding affirmative action, the debate surrounding affirmative action, is whether it is moral or not, or whether it is a just thing to do. We have a question. I mean, in other words, questions about its legality are questions about its morality. And so, in fact, just this election in California, if you follow just a week ago, California, on its ballot in California, they tried to pass a referendum on the ballot that the public got to vote on that would have decided whether or not California would be allowed to reinstate affirmative action policies in the context of hiring and admissions. It used to be the law. It was struck down it went away as the law, and they were trying to bring it back. I think the proposition failed. So this question is, I guess what I'm saying is this debate is ongoing. It's not a settled question. The morality of it is an ongoing debate. And so affirmative action, quite simply, is the attempt to use race, gender. Race and gender are the big two, but some feature or characteristic of a person over which they have no control that might affect how they are treated in the world. In particular, how they are treated in the context of hiring decisions and admissions decisions. And so it is to try to say we have to take these factors into account: race, gender, disability, anything along those lines. It's the argument for affirmative action is saying we have to take these factors into account because of the historical legacy of racism, of sexism, of ableism. Ableism would be the same kind of thing. It's a critique. It's a critique of those who regard people with disabilities as somehow inferior or something. And so it is the argument that we have to take those factors into account in order to try and level the playing field and to give everyone an equal opportunity when it comes equal access and equal opportunity when it comes to these kinds of decisions. And so that's what affirmative action is. And what Sandel does in this chapter is he just kind of surveys a number of different arguments, either sort of in favor of or against affirmative action. And starting on page 170, I just want to look at the two primary arguments that Sandel is providing for why affirmative action is justified, why it is moral. or just to allow universities and employers to consider race. And race is usually what the debate is about, but there are other factors used sometimes. But this chapter focuses on race. So the question is it morally justifiable for employers and universities to use race as one factor, not the only factor, but as a factor in making hiring and admissions decisions? And so the first argument that's given is he calls it the compensatory argument. And he says here the compensatory argument views affirmative action as a remedy for past wrongs. It says minority students should be given preference to make up for a history of discrimination that has placed them at an unfair advantage. This argument treats admission primarily as a benefit to the recipient and seeks to distribute the benefit in a way that compensates for past injustices and lingering effects. So, again, Sandel, the title of the book is Justice, and he's saying, look, this is a way it is a way to promote justice in society. And the particular kind of justice we're concerned with here is attempting to right past wrongs. And, the thing is also, focusing on it only as a backward-looking phenomenon is also potentially not true, because I think some would argue we are still in the midst of a society in which racial discrimination and racism are rampant. And so some might even argue that we're not only trying to compensate for the past, we're also trying to compensate for the effect of the past on the present. And as it sort of continues, maybe in new forms, maybe in different ways, maybe racism isn't the same phenomenon that it used to be in the past, but it's still something that society is dealing with and reckoning with. And so we're even trying to level the playing field now. And so it's not only a backward-looking phenomenon. But ultimately, the question is one about justice, and it is saying that justice has to do here with righting past wrongs, treating people fairly. And the only way that we can treat people fairly is by taking history into account. That in some ways we would be lying to ourselves if we said that the long, tumultuous history of racism and discrimination in this country does not play a factor in race and hiring decisions. We're arguing, with something like implicit bias, for example, there's lots of studies that indicate that people are influenced by implicit bias simply by the way a person looks. So they're not overtly racist. They might say, look, I don't think that black people are any worse than white people. But just the subconscious associations that they make with the sight of somebody who's black versus the subconscious association they make with the association of somebody that's white. And that may not be their fault, but that is a process of socialization, of culturalization, of larger trends in society that are influencing the ways we think in subtle ways that we may not be aware of. And so the affirmative action argument would say, look, because of the presence of these structural things like implicit bias, that we need to find a way to compensate for that. And so the only way to treat people fairly is to take that history into account. And it would be not possible to treat people fairly if we didn't take that history into account. So that's one argument, the compensatory justification. Another justification is one that is more, the first one is sort of, here's why affirmative action is good in principle. In principle, conceptually, affirmative action is a good thing because it promotes justice and fairness. But then we might ask, let's assume we agree that it is a good thing. What else can it achieve? And so this is more of a utilitarian argument. And what it can achieve is diversity. And so the argument is simply that within the workplace, And within a college environment, um, you know, everyone benefits from the presence of a diverse population, from being exposed to different experiences and different viewpoints that they might not have otherwise been exposed to. And so the affirmative action argument here is saying we can allow affirmative action because of the value that our society places on diverse viewpoints and diverse perspectives. And so this argument says the diversity argument is an argument in the name of the common good of the school itself and also of the wider society. It holds that a racially mixed student body is desirable because it enables students to learn more from one another than they would if they all came from similar backgrounds. So that's a pretty straightforward argument. We don't here have to argue about. So one of the things he mentioned there. So what one of the things he mentions with that first argument about the compensatory justification. In some ways, the compensatory justification says, well, if we're looking to the past, then somehow you're saying that those of us in the present are somehow responsible for what people did in the past. For example, somebody might say, look, I'm not racist. Yes, there may have been, overtly racist people in the 60s or throughout history, whenever, that had these thoughts, but I'm not responsible for that. That's not my fault. And that could be a complicated argument, that how do we determine whether somebody is responsible in the present for something that happened in the past. What Sandel is saying, the diversity argument has the advantage of not having to wade in to those kinds of disputes. We just have a straightforward argument. Taking race into account will give us a wider variety of perspectives and experiences that can help human beings grow as people and become better people. And some might say, after all, if you look at the United States population, it is not just white people that live in the United States. You have, I don't know what the percentages are, but it's something around, I'd say 15% black, 15 to 20% Hispanic or Latino. So, those are just estimates, guesses on my part. But given that that's what the United States population as a whole looks like, that should be reflected, especially in public institutions. Maybe not in private institutions, but in public institutions that are using taxpayer dollars. Maybe we should make the argument, or we can make the argument, that the population of our college campuses should reflect the population of the country as accurately as possible. And so the diversity argument is maybe more appealing, at least practically. And now I kind of want to look at some objections that Sandel raises. So at the bottom of 172, Sandel says critics of the diversity argument offer two objections. And I want to look at these one by one. So there's one objection that's just a practical objection. So he makes a distinct. So here we're focusing on objections to the diversity argument. Two objections. One objection is a practical objection. And this is kind of a utilitarian objection that just says, look, these policies don't achieve their outcomes. So it's not as though we don't think promoting diversity is a good thing. We do think that being exposed to as many viewpoints as possible is a good thing, but affirmative action just doesn't achieve what it purports to do. And so maybe we should try to find some other way to ensure diversity on a college campus instead of using affirmative action policies. And so he says the use of racial preferences will not bring about a more pluralistic society. And it lists a number of reasons there. That it may have some unintended side effects, that it's just not going to achieve what it wants to achieve. That's the practical objection. It doesn't find anything wrong with affirmative action as such, But it says if diversity is the goal, it won't achieve it. Now, the other more familiar objection, and it's on 173, it says, do racial preferences violate rights? And this focuses more on, so he references, Kant here in this discussion, focusing on autonomy and individual rights and things like that. Um, and the argument here is that it's actually unjust to use race, because what it does is it discriminates against other people. It says, well, if you're black, we're going to use that as a factor. But if you're not black, then you are put at a disadvantage as a result. In some ways, the argument is that we're involved in what a lot of you often hear, that this is reverse discrimination, that somehow white people are being discriminated against as a result of affirmative action. And so there is that argument, and the right that's being violated is potentially, it's a right about, it's a meritocratic right. It's a violation of my right to only be judged according to the merits that I bring to the table. It's my right to be judged only according to, I don't know, test scores, things I did in high school, and things like that. But it's only, the university only should judge its applicants according to their merit. And to consider other things violates my right to be judged according to that. Now, there are some responses to this that Sandel covers. And I'm not going to go too far into it at the moment, but the response, and he references a philosopher of law named Ronald Dworkin, and Dworkin says, look, this right that you have doesn't really exist. So he says at the bottom of 173 here, Sandel's considering this view, he says, perhaps the right at stake is the right to be considered according to academic criteria alone. On this view, if my grades, test scores, and other measures of academic promise land me in the top group of applicants, then I deserve to be admitted. In other words, to be considered according to my academic merit alone. But basically, this philosopher of law he references, named Ronald Dworkin, and again, it's good to be clear in Sandel's writing. Sandel is not endorsing any of these positions. He's referencing the views of others. So he wasn't a libertarian. He wasn't a free market guy. He's also not agreeing with Dworkin here. He's simply presenting Dworkin's view. And what Dworkin says is this right doesn't actually exist. You don't have that right as an applicant when you apply to a school. A university, he basically says, a university can define for itself whatever it wants its mission to be. And so if a university wants to say that its mission is to accept a certain kind of student over another kind of student, the university is free to do so. So this right that we're claiming is being violated, Dworkin is saying he doesn't know where the basis of that right comes from, because it doesn't actually exist, because universities can define for themselves what their mission is. So what here lies, so on the bottom of 174, here lies the deep, though contested claim at the heart of the diversity argument for affirmative action. Admission is not an honor bestowed to reward superior merit. So admission is not a recognition on you that you achieved something great. Neither the student with high test scores nor the student from a disadvantaged background deserves to be admitted. Her admission is justified insofar as it contributes to the social purpose of the university, not because it rewards the student for her merit or virtue, independently defined. So the university can set for itself whatever it wants as its goal and as its social purpose. In this case, the role of the university in society is to act as an institution that promotes diversity in society and allows people to have diverse experiences. That's the role of the university. The role of the university is not to be a place that rewards merit and punishes failure. That's not what the university is. So that's the sort of response to this objection. That somehow you're violating my right to be judged according to merit, and Dworkin is saying, look, that right doesn't exist. That's not a right that anybody has. And so far as the university defines its mission and decides who it's going to accept in line with its purpose, that right doesn't exist. Now, the one other argument I kind of want to think about real quick, and this is not something that Sandel goes over in the book, is this argument about reverse discrimination. That somehow that you are violating. If I'm white and you tell a black person that you're going to take their race into account, you're violating my right. Well, I mean, there are two ways. So first of all, I mean, one response to this might be that in fact, white people actually also have plenty of benefits from their own kind of affirmative action. Things, and I know this happens at Clemson, and I'm certainly not faulting anybody who benefits from this, but some might claim that white people have their own forms of affirmative action. Things like legacy admissions, where students are admitted on the basis of the fact that they had siblings or parents who went to Clemson, or their parents are big donors that went to Clemson. And this is not just true at Clemson, it's true at other big universities. So that might be one response, is the white people already receive their own, they already are discriminated against in a good way. And one other thing to say is simply that I'm not sure it's possible. I'm not sure that, I guess the response, and this is not my response, but I think one response to this is discrimination against so white people, what we might say is that white people have lots of benefits. Historically, they have been the ones who have benefited from a lots of different institutions in society because they have the ones who have been setting the terms of these institutions. And so to say that we're discriminating against the very individuals who allowed for the conditions of discrimination against black people to be sort of happening in the first place, something seems wrong with that argument. So we might even say, is it possible for a white person to be discriminated against if they themselves are the ones who have laid the foundations for discrimination against minorities? That's just one sort of possibility. So that's actually all I have for this week. I just wanted to kind of think through I think what Sandel does nicely is he shows here's the issue, here are the justifications, here are the arguments in favor, here are the arguments opposed, here are some of the responses. And that's a good way to think about what a philosophical argument is.